As the second decade of the 21st century progressed, something unsettling was developing. Culture and politics in the Western world was becoming increasingly polarized. I mean, people have always been passionate about the causes they support, and that's not a bad thing. Debates inevitably become heated sometimes. But what's new is that there was a qualitative change in the way social debates proceeded. People became strongly polarized on two extremes on many hot-button issues, and they increasingly believed they could and should do everything to win. No compromises, no principles, no civility. People stopped debating in good faith, and productive dialogue started to suffer. I first noticed this back in 2014, when there was a campaign to boycott a major internet company that had employed a new CEO who was against gay marriage. Now, I was, and still am, a big supporter of gay marriage. But I've always thought that our movement did things the civil and principled way. We were about love, and we certainly didn't pressure companies to fire people who disagreed with us. Until now. Anyway, the boycotters ended up getting their way, and I was ashamed of our movement for the first time. The next 2 years, with an American election in the background, were even more brutal. Speakers were disinvited or deplatformed, people were attacked over what they said in the past, and everything simply became crazy. I always thought I was on the progressive side. I believed in reform to make people's lives better, but this was not what I believed in. And so, this was the start of one of my biggest political awakenings. It was a twisted journey that would take me swinging to the right, back to the left, back again, and so on. This film is about that journey, what I found on the journey, what lessons I learned, and how it has shaped my worldview today. One important thing. Please watch the whole thing before you jump to any conclusions, because it is a twisting story with surprising turns all the time. Any developments in the middle don't necessarily lead to what you might expect later on. Also, please keep an open mind when watching. The developments of the past few years have been nothing less than crazy. We often couldn't see everything clearly at first, and we might be falsely persuaded by one side or another at different times. Indeed, this is one of the major points I'm making in this whole film.
Anyway, let's begin. I used to be one of those people who got their news from mainstream media and major websites. As new cultural forces were becoming increasingly influential in the new media, including blogs, videos, and other content, I was not quite aware of the cultural earthquake that was underway at first. In late 2016, just as the US presidential election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump entered its final stretch, I began to pay increasing attention to this new media. And when Trump won against all predictions from mainstream media, I finally woke up to how much they were missing out on things. Around the time I started paying attention to the new media, there was a big debate over there about a new documentary on the men's rights movement titled The Red Pill. Feminists opposed the screening in many countries, and right-leaning people decried what they saw as censorship. As someone who identifies as a feminist and as someone who has always hated censorship, I became increasingly curious. As I did my research further, I found that the film actually went into the issues of non-custodial fathers. As a lonely feminist who actually deeply cares about non-custodial fathers, this greatly interested me. I eventually decided to watch the film, which was already available online. The film itself wasn't as controversial as I had expected, and it did raise some important issues. But one thing that hit me was that the feminists kept saying that men were privileged, and the men's rights people kept saying the opposite. This, I thought, was what was preventing them from having a productive dialogue. Privileged versus marginalized, oppressor versus oppressed. This was also the language that was lately popping up everywhere. It's divisive, it's not very productive, and I certainly don't like it. I will have much more to talk about on this later. I also did a fair bit of research on the concept of the red pill. It turns out that it was an increasingly popular concept to express a feeling about finding the truth about something. While it did have its origins in men's rights circles, it has since been adopted by many other people, including some women too. So yes, women can and do use this term too. After all, we all want to find the truth, and many of us were beginning to think the mainstream media wasn't telling the whole story.
I guess around the time of 2014 to 2018 or so, the idea of the red pill really spoke to many people. Now, I don't mean in the men's movement sense or in the conservative politics sense, like how red is the color of the US Republican Party, but I mean in the mythological sense, like how the idea originally came about. The idea of the red pill originally came from the movie series The Matrix, particularly the first movie, where the main character was given a choice of taking a red pill, which would lead him to discover the truth about the world he was living in, or taking a blue pill, which would send him back into blissful ignorance of his real reality. I guess then, the reason why the red pill became a resonant concept was that many of us knew that something was wrong, that our reality was being changed by people with an agenda, and we were being gaslighted, told that nothing was happening, even though something was really happening. Many of us wanted to take the red pill, to know the truth, to know why our world was changing in unexpected ways. And it's clear that something was indeed happening. I remember going to college and becoming political for the first time in the first decade of the 21st century. Cultural and political discussions back then surely weren't full of who was more privileged or who was more oppressed. Instead, we saw the elites taking taxpayer money and waging needless wars in the Middle East as the real problem, and we, the individualists who wanted our freedom, our sovereignty over our own lives back, we were in the fight together, regardless of race, gender, sexuality, or any other immutable characteristic. The bottom line it was, when I was a college student, liberal meant liberal, as in liberty, as in opposing the wars being waged by the elite, supporting gay marriage, opposing censorship, supporting maximum freedom for every individual, and so on. The progressive platform certainly didn't include concepts like safe speech or check your privilege, concepts that effectively act to limit the free speech and general freedom of individuals. Back then, there was even an American saying that liberals supported the First Amendment but were skeptical of the Second, and conservatives supported the Second Amendment but were skeptical of the First. The First Amendment being, of course, about free speech, and the Second Amendment being about guns. The fact is, if you have any doubts at all about free speech, you ain't a liberal by my definition, which means much of the so-called progressivism in recent years actually ain't liberal. This is a real change, a real problem I felt we needed to get to the bottom of. I'm of the firm belief that if there's a problem, then it needs to be discovered and resolved. If to take the red pill means to see reality, no matter how dark and scary it might be, and to take the blue pill means to pretend that nothing is happening, to choose to retreat into a comfortable ignorance, then I thought this would be the moment we should take the red pill. To be honest, back in 2016 I was much more naive about a lot of the things that were affecting our politics and culture. I had much to learn, and the process was quite messy looking back. I never expected the plot to be quite so complex, and the motives of people on both sides to be quite so questionable. The past few years was really my own red pill experience, and I would never see the world in the same way again.
Looking back, the year 2017 was a period of particularly rapid change. The disorientation of many people coming out of the 2016 US elections, with its drama and its unexpected results, were a big factor in this. Indeed, many people in the professional commentary class made the observation that 2016, with the twin victories of Brexit in the UK and Trump in the US, changed everything. However, in other sectors of society, I was seeing change of another kind. That didn't look like it had much to do with the people supporting Trump or Brexit, speakers being disinvited or deplatformed, statues being toppled, actions that I really didn't like, to be honest. There was also an increasingly common usage of the terms socialist or Marxist among people who practiced those actions. Again, I didn't really understand why, but there was a time in which I did refer to those people as socialists, for lack of a better term, because that's what they call themselves. I was confused, but I had no good answers. It was in this background that I started doing deep research into the beliefs fueling the recent changes. The other thing that made it onto my political radar during this time was a group of thinkers called the Intellectual Dark Web, or the IDW for short. They had all sorts of ideas, some of which I found interesting, some which I really disagreed with. But one thing they stood for was free speech, which I felt was being eroded quickly. One particularly prominent member of the IDW was Dr. Jordan Peterson, a Canadian professor of psychology. I had plenty of disagreements with him. I even wrote an article critiquing some of his stances, which proved to be quite popular. However, by 2018, Peterson's most famous words were postmodern neo-Marxism, which was a term he had used for the kind of self-identified socialists I was talking about. There was great controversy about the appropriateness of this term. Some said Peterson was inventing things, but some said that there was certainly some truth to what he was saying. This controversy made me dig even deeper. And the deeper I dug, the more surprising and unsettling stuff I found. Soon, I was no longer interested in if Peterson was correct or not, because there was much more important stuff to be concerned about.
Through a tortuous journey of self-learning, I came to the conclusion that radical critical theory is at the root of many of the problematic and illiberal aspects of contemporary progressivism, which have also in turn triggered a reactionary backlash response on the hard right. Some people confuse critical theory with socialism, like I did earlier in my self-learning journey, both because critical theory has its roots in Western socialism, and because most critical theory activists are also socialists even in this day and age, and hence identify as socialists. However, critical theory should not be confused with socialism as it is usually understood, because it is crucial to remember that critical theory is mostly cultural rather than economic. Furthermore, a lot of critical theory's foundation is directly defined against the classical liberal framework that came out of the Enlightenment, which explains why critical theory activists are often very illiberal in their outlook. To understand critical theory, one has to begin with Marxism. After all, critical theory at its foundation was supposed to be about applying the method of Marx to things other than capitalist economics, which in practice usually meant cultural stuff. To use a more academic terminology, critical theory values Marxism as the methodology rather than as the conclusion, i.e. Marxist doctrine. Unlike, say, the former USSR, which attempted to practice the actual doctrines of Marxism, critical theory practices what they see as the methods used to arrive at that Marxist doctrine and applies the same methods to examine cultural issues. It's sort of like how in academia, a lot of research is done by following the methodology of other people. Since this methodology is applied to a different population or a different issue, one would get different results and conclusions. This essentially means that critical theory is almost infinitely extendable and would yield more and more conclusions that sort of rhymes with Marxist ideas but are not part of Marxism itself. This is why critical theory has sometimes been called neo-Marxism. Critical theory's roots in Marxism has given it a particular bias in the way it sees the world. Marxism, as many of you would know, is an ideology based on the worldview that history is driven by the conflict between economic classes. In the construction of the general critical theory framework, several fundamental beliefs of Marxism have essentially been generalized so as to be applicable to cultural matters. These include, firstly, society is made up of systems of oppression that operate in a similar way to capitalism. Secondly, these systems create oppressor and oppressed groups. Thirdly, the oppression is so ingrained in the culture that we can't see it clearly. Fourthly, the traditional ideas and institutions we inherited are part of this oppressive system because, as per Marx, the dominant ideas in each era of society are the ideas of the ruling class. And finally, the construction of these systems of oppression is rooted in history, so it is essentially always worthwhile to relitigate history. From these beliefs, one can derive a wide variety of radical positions. For example, if traditional ideas and institutions are inherently parts of systems of oppression, then they are unreformable and unredeemable and must be dismantled whole. Also, if society is defined by the dynamics between oppressor groups and oppressed groups, then there simply is not much value for debates in the marketplace of ideas. Rather, all politics becomes about identity interests. Furthermore, if the dominant ideas of society are inherently serving the interests of the powerful, then free speech would not logically lead to sound ideas to prevail. Indeed, this is the core argument behind Herbert Marcuse's infamous 1965 essay Repressive Tolerance, which argued that indiscriminate tolerance of all ideas would lead to the repressive status quo prevailing. This essay is still sometimes referenced to this day by opponents of free speech. Now, I'm not saying that critical theory is always wrong or that there ain't any power and oppression dynamics happening between groups in society. However, if you take this to be the fundamental lens to examine every issue, this would yield conclusions that are unhealthily exaggerated towards conflict and ignore the many times that cooperation, rationality, and compassion have instead prevailed. Furthermore, given that culture is a complicated thing, force-fitting a model that was essentially designed to explain 19th century economics onto cultural issues, no matter if you agree with that model or not, would logically be counterproductive. This is why, in real life, critical theory has often heightened the level of conflict and animosity between groups. Furthermore, critical theory's tendency to downplay rationality and the power of good ideas, and to see almost everything as a raw power struggle, is indeed dangerous for the future of humanity. Even more problematic is that, after the 1970s or so, ideas from French postmodernism, from thinkers like Foucault, have been incorporated into many recent critical theories, which is what is called postmodern critical theory. I guess Jordan Peterson's term postmodern neo-Marxism actually refers to this. The problem with postmodern critical theory is that it is often essentially anti-science. Combining the postmodern distrust of science and reason with the critical theory stance that the dominant ideas of each era serve the ruling class gives the result that science and reason themselves are products of the current systems of oppression that serve the supposed oppressors. This is why parts of the far left are now saying that the scientific method is inherently white or colonial, or why they are trying to complicate scientific arguments about climate change with stuff about colonialism that could end up detracting from concerted efforts to combat climate change. This new anti-science attitude is, of course, very deleterious for the future of humanity. I believe that it represents nothing less than an assault by radical philosophy on the practice of objective science. Finally, I couldn't stress more that, no matter if you agree with socialism or not, critical theory shouldn't be conflated with socialism, because you could technically practice critical theory without being a socialist, and many socialists oppose critical theory too. Any conflation would just muddy the whole thing, and reduce clarity about what we should be focusing on. This is why, although I think Jordan Peterson's description of critical theory as postmodern neo-Marxism is technically sound, it should still be avoided. Because if you use that confusing term, people will go like Slavoj Žižek did during his debate with Peterson, where he focused on the fact that people like Foucault were not Marxists, which they clearly weren't.
Coming to understand the huge and increasing influence critical theory and postmodernism is having on society was really a big moment for me. Furthermore, the fact that only the right side of politics seemed to care about this was a real shock to my thought system. For all my adult life, I have been fighting alongside people on the progressive side of politics for things like racial and gender equality, ending the wars, and LGBT rights. As a result, I may have been a bit biased in the past for thinking that the progressives were always the good guys and the conservatives often just raised unsound objections to everything because they wanted to slow down necessary change, like the ridiculous argument about how gay marriage would destroy family values. I mean, I still think this observation is valid when it comes to gay marriage, something which I'm still 99% sure there is no sound, non-religious case against. But the fact that the right was seriously opposing critical theory and postmodernism, and they were the only people talking about it, while liberals were largely absent from the discussion, gave me newfound respect for the right. So began a new era in my journey of navigating through political ideas, where I would become consciously committed to having a roughly 50-50 split between left-leaning and right-leaning sources for my intake of ideas. I thought this was the only way I could become more unbiased and not get inevitably looped in by the postmodern critical theory influence, even if they got stronger on the left.
The first thing I noticed since I began my new 50-50 diet of news and ideas was that the left-leaning media and the right-leaning media were presenting very different pictures of society. The phrase, people aren't living in the same reality anymore, has been thrown around a lot in recent years, but I was really experiencing this dissonance head-on with my 50-50 informational diet. A good thing about this is that it really makes you trust the talking heads less and research the issues in depth yourself. As a result, I learned a lot about many things just in the past 2 to 3 years. I learned that there were plenty of good ideas on both sides, many of which aren't actually incompatible with what the other side wants either, so there's probably more room for cooperation than many people may think. I also found that, unfortunately, there was plenty of deceptive information on both sides that amounts to borderline fake news. I think it is largely this that is driving the polarization. To put it simply, people are hating the other side because someone has painted a straw man of the other side. Now, this applies equally to both the left and the right. Regarding the ongoing debate about critical theory and postmodernism, which the center-left seemed to be determined to ignore, while the right and the far left were increasingly engaged in, I have found that the same pattern seemed to apply. When people on the right criticized critical theory or postmodernism, they often painted the left with a broad brush, unfairly implicating everyone from mainstream progressive liberals to class-first economic-focused leftists in the postmodern critical theory plot, when they are clearly not involved. On the other hand, elements of the far left have sought to beat around the bush to frustrate the right's criticism of postmodern critical theory, ranging from simply accusing people of imagining things to overly focusing on Jordan Peterson's controversial choice of terminology, even to conflating it with a certain dangerous conspiracy theory, which I believe is essentially an attempt at making the whole discussion taboo. In short, there is a lot of bad faith arguments from both sides, and a lot of confusion for people who are just setting out to try and understand all this. However, there is hope too. After a year of immersing myself in complex and engaging ideas on both sides, I have found plenty of common ground, more than I ever thought there would be. I have come to the conclusion that it is the elites, working in the service of vested interests, who are trying to tear us apart, to polarize us with emotional appeals, often based on what is essentially fake news. Therefore, the polarization that looks so real on the surface is only skin deep, and almost entirely created by elite establishments on both sides with their often murky agendas. I thought that if we could build a big tent and get people talking to each other, we may be able to resolve it.
So, I've found both many pleasant surprises and many unpleasant, almost pointless fights in the time since I began my 50-50 informational diet. In 2019, with elections in multiple Western countries, and with the US gearing up for the widely anticipated 2020 election, both of these phenomena were turned up to 11. Several politicians were running campaigns with a big emphasis on building a big tent and bringing people together, while media talking heads on both sides sometimes made unconvincing accusations or even hypocritical looking moves. It was during this time that I asked hard questions about the people I was following, especially those who appeared to be allies in this fight against postmodernism and critical theory.
Ever since my awakening about postmodernism and critical theory, I have had almost outsized respect for those who were taking a clear stance against these schools of thought. In particular, I looked up to the intellectual dark web, or the IDW, which had many thinkers who were willing to take on postmodernism and critical theory. There were also other thinkers, mostly right-leaning, who were loosely associated with this group, who also talked about similar things. In hindsight, I was perhaps a bit too uncritical of some of their observations, but at the time, I was getting increasingly frustrated about the encroachment of critical theory on previous liberal social circles, spaces, and movements, and these people sounded like just what the world needed to hear right now. I don't know when I started to seriously question what I would broadly call the right-leaning anti-critical theory movement. Perhaps it started in May 2019, when Quillette, the online publication most famously associated with IDW-type ideas, published an article essentially claiming that Bill Shorten and the Australian Labor Party lost the Australian election because of the SJWs, even drawing parallels to Hillary Clinton's loss in the 2016 US election. The problem is, the 2019 Australian election was largely fought on economic grounds, and there clearly wasn't anywhere near the same level of focus on identity politics as during Hillary's 2016 campaign. The thing is, when one begins to see a significant role for SJWs in an election where none of the observers on the ground, none of the people actually reporting on the election in the country saw that, perhaps, just perhaps, one is beginning to see SJWs everywhere. I sensed that the RTW and IDW adjacent were beginning to see the world in a way that was perhaps overly influenced by the particular circumstances of American politics in 2015 to 16. Later in the same year came the Canadian election. Close to the election, Liberal Prime Minister Justin Trudeau suffered a blackface controversy when photos from a fancy costume party he attended when he was much younger went viral. Given that this was essentially an attempt at cancellation using political correctness taken to the extreme, I would have thought that the anti-cancel culture crowd would be glad to stand up for Trudeau. But I was wrong. You see, much of the anti-cancel culture commentariat were deeply wedded to the political right, and they saw the very liberal Trudeau as the enemy. Therefore, they essentially twisted their argument around, painting this episode as Trudeau getting a taste of his own medicine, some kind of cosmic justice, because Trudeau is a politically correct liberal, and politically correct liberals are supposed to support cancel culture. There's so much wrong with this argument. Firstly, it's hypocritical to the core to only stand against the cancel culture mob when it suits you. Secondly, it's stupid to paint all liberals, even those who are usually politically correct in their speech, as in the same boat as cancel culture. Given that liberalism is not the same thing as critical theory, it is not surprising that there are indeed many progressive liberals, including politically correct liberals, who actually support free speech and oppose cancel culture. The publication of an open letter in support of free speech in the Harper's Magazine the following year, signed by mostly liberal intellectuals, is the best proof of this point. I mean, even President Obama has spoken against aspects of cancel culture, something that the right-leaning commentariat still would not acknowledge to this day. It sometimes seems like some of them, at least, are more interested in gaining the maximum political mileage out of smearing progressive liberals with the postmodern critical theory brush, rather than to examine things as they really are. Meanwhile, in America, the Democratic primaries were heating up, and many candidates were running on a Big Tent message, including Andrew Yang, Cory Booker, Tulsi Gabbard, Pete Buttigieg, and indeed the eventual nominee Joe Biden. Yang, in particular, made a big attempt to reach across the aisle to Republicans, including those who voted for President Trump in 2016. As a result, he attracted an unusually large number of people who would normally vote Republican. The diversity within his support base also meant that people with very different backgrounds and views were able to coexist within the movement, which meant that they had the opportunity to talk to each other and find some common ground. I came to view this model as the solution that will solve the polarization problem. Yet, I don't see people in the IDW or IDW-adjacent sphere rushing to emulate it. I mean, there was plenty of interest in Yang and his UBI plan within the IDW, but they weren't as interested in his ability to dissolve the polarization. It almost seemed that the IDW were perfectly fine with the polarization continuing, even though it is preventing people from having the fruitful discussions they claim to want. Either that, or maybe they have just given up on ending the polarization altogether. As 2020 arrived, the attention turned to the 2020 US presidential election between President Donald Trump and Vice President Joe Biden. Biden was about as far away from an identity politics candidate as the Democrats could have gotten, yet none of the IDW and IDW-adjacent people crying about identity politics seem to have noticed that. Instead, right-leaning commentators have even sometimes sought to paint Joe Biden with that broad identity politics brush just because he is in the same party as people like AOC. On the other hand, they are equally eager to jump on Biden whenever he says something that would be considered unwoke. Apparently, wokeness and identity politics were now mainly being wielded by some people on the right as a club to beat the Democrats with, even if it was being wielded in clearly self-contradictory ways. The IDW was again disappointing because they didn't seem to have a problem with this. In May 2020, the violent death of George Floyd in Minnesota sparked a revival of the Black Lives Matter protests. As you may know by now, those protests contained a mix of different people. There were certainly politically radical elements that are rooted in the revolutionary critical race theory that sought to use the movement to make a point about their ideology. But then, there were also lots of people who were peaceful protesters asking for police reform. On the right, there was often a broad conflation of the radicals with the movement itself, painting everyone involved with a broad brush. This approach was one I was uncomfortable with. I mean, I'm no fan of critical race theory, and I'm glad someone is taking a stance against it, but to wield it as an excuse to dismiss the voices that demand to be heard and the issues that demand to be addressed, I fear this would just discredit opponents of critical theory. There were real people facing real problems. My take was that you couldn't just tell them that it's all an illusion caused by an ideology. Indeed, my experience tells me that failure to provide a liberal reformist solution to satisfy the demands would only further embolden those who are pushing for the mainstreaming of critical race theory. Regarding the IDW itself, the last straw for me came soon after U.S. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg died in September 2020. Several IDW figures, who I won't name here, not only dismissed the widespread anger at Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell's clear hypocrisy regarding the appropriateness of confirming a new justice during an election year, they even went as far as justifying this by essentially saying that politics is power play. Such an admission, in my view, contradicts and discredits the core ethos of the IDW, which is that we should have discussions about ideas, that it is the marketplace of ideas that ultimately should matter, not group-based power dynamics. It made me question if these people were only yielding the liberal philosophy of John Locke to advance their views when it suited them, or were deep down inside already harboring what is ironically a postmodern critical theory style of political worldview. My point is, you can't claim to abide by Lockean classical liberal values while thinking of politics as power play. Such a combination doesn't make logical sense. It doesn't make moral sense. It doesn't stand up to any vigorous analysis.
The past few years have really been a wild ride for me, in terms of politics, worldviews, and ideas. I set out to investigate the things that were making society divisive. Little did I know I was only seeing the tip of the iceberg. As for who is responsible for the polarization, the divisiveness, and the lack of productive dialogue, well, I've come to the conclusion that both extremes are to blame. The far left with their problematic theories, as well as the hard right with their agenda-driven biased reporting. And even the intellectuals who are supposed to be upholding the sensible middle, like those people in the IDW, must share part of the blame, as they often forget what they should be doing and end up getting swayed by the bias of their apparent friends too. I still stand by my view that postmodernism and critical theory can become harmful to society because they create division and bitterness. To be fair, there is indeed a grain of truth in the idea that power imbalances in society play a hand in shaping things, and this is far from ideal. However, to overly focus on that would be to the detriment of building a better world dedicated to free thinking, rational debate, respect for individual dignity, and compassion for each other regardless of race, gender, or other group-based characteristics. This is why liberalism is much better. The IDW and other associated, mostly right-leaning people have played an important role in alerting us to the dangers of critical theories' encroachment on liberalism. However, I don't really agree with their methods in dealing with the issue. Forming an us versus them dynamic over things like identity politics really isn't helpful. I believe that ultimately, the only way to revive the Enlightenment liberal consensus and stop postmodernism and critical theory is to end the division, end the polarization, and bring people together. Another important point is that, while I believe that postmodern critical theory is misguided, the grievances that they discuss, the negative energy that gives credence to these theories, is often very real. To show that liberalism is better than critical theory, we must be dedicated to resolve the social issues that gave rise to that negative energy in the first place. Ultimately, I think the most important thing is to be able to rise above the left versus right paradigm and look at things as they are without factional bias. We need to be prepared to listen to voices on all sides, and we need to be prepared to take action to remedy problems raised by any side, regardless of whether our friends like it or not. This is what a true free thinker would do anyway. A feminist should be able to sympathize with a non-custodial father. A straight person should be able to empathize with a gay couple who still lack full rights in many parts of the world. An atheist should be able to understand the importance of religious freedom. We should all believe in equal treatment regardless of race, no matter what race we are. And so on. The elites, with their agendas coming from various angles, want to divide us using their ideological frameworks. We must resist them and keep our true humanity intact. To go back to the red pill analogy from The Matrix, I think The Matrix could be an apt metaphor for the divisive ideological constructs of the elites which trap us in an us versus them illusion against our fellow human beings. Therefore, when we understand and reclaim our shared humanity and become aware of and able to resist the elite-driven divisions, this would actually be like taking the red pill, leaving the Matrix and coming to understand our actual reality.